In this video, we will be learning about the fundamental aspects of evolution. Now, if you look at the chapter on evolution in your file or in your textbook, it talks about diversity, change, and continuity. And we've already covered the origin of an idea about origins in Evolution Part 1 and Evolution Part 2 videos. So we continue today with the third video, so have a look at the previous ones if you've missed it. The subject assessment guidelines expect you to understand and to know these five things. Firstly, you need to describe the difference between these two big words, punctuated equilibrium and gradualism. Then also apply Darwin's theory of natural selection in detail with some examples, and then have a look at what artificial selection is with its examples. In previous videos, we actually already looked at Darwin's theory of natural selection. So let's look at outcomes 2 and 3, or question 2 and 3 first, and look at Darwin's theory, how we can apply it with actual examples. Just to recap quickly, evolution by natural selection happens in a population, not in an individual, and it's always driven by a change in the environment. As I always say, there's no group of organisms or an animal that decides by itself, oh, I think I'd like to change, and then whoops, overnight they are different. No. It's usually the environment that changes that causes natural selection to happen, or a change in the population to occur. Natural selection happens because of the following things. Firstly, we have more offspring born than an environment can actually sustain. Now, amongst these offspring, there will be variations. If the environment changes, some of the variants amongst the offspring will be suitable for that new environment. These suitable traits that these variation of the offspring have will benefit them and allow them to survive in this new and changed environment. And obviously, if they're able to survive, they will be the ones that can reproduce and have babies, and obviously their babies will look like them. Now, I know this sounds like a lot of boring information, but to make it easier to remember, we're going to take the key word from each of those statements and just use the first letter of each of these. Using the keywords, we can make a little acronym called Many Vets Rescue Babies. So the many, the M is going to remind us that more offspring are born than can survive in the environment. Each of the V, E, T, and S is for variations, environment, traits that are suitable. The R in rescue is for reproduce, and then the B is for babies, in other words, the offspring. You need to be able to apply the principles of natural selection to any kind of scenario, any animal. You won't be asked just to repeat these points or rewrite them. The question usually says, use Darwin's theory of natural selection to explain how. And then they give you a specific passage of some sort of animal. So let's try one example. Let's say the passage that you're given has information about this black little lizard and this white or very creamy colored lizard. The question will say, how did these two species come about? So you can formulate your answer by using Many Vets Rescue Babies as a template for your answer. So many moons ago, more lizards were born in this environment than the environment could actually sustain. Amongst those lizards, there were variations. Some black ones, some creamy white ones. Then the environment changed. So let's say the environment changed from a forest area into a more desert-like area. Then the trait that would be suitable to survive in a forest would be the lizards that have the darker skin, while the lighter skinned lizards would be best suited and camouflaged in a desert area. So whichever area they were more suited to survive in, this is where they would indeed survive. The survivors are obviously the ones that will get to reproduce, and their babies will inherit their suitable traits. Now, obviously, if you are given a question where you should explain Darwin's theory of natural selection in a long way, like we just did now with the Many Vets Rescue Babies thing, the question could be anything from 8 to 10 marks. But you might just be asked to give an example for something like 2 marks. And then this is something that you can mention. The natural selection that takes place in the peppered moth in the UK. Amongst peppered moths, we find 2 variants, dark moths and speckled moths. And their surrounding environment actually determines which of these variants are more seen, more common, more expressed. In times of pollution, surfaces are dark, so dark moths are favored because they are camouflaged on these dark surfaces, and the speckled moths would be rare. Can you actually see on this picture that there are 2 moths? Look at the speckled moth on the right hand side, stand out like a sore thumb. So he's not very camouflaged, so he's going to disappear. But look at that one. There's the dark moth, well camouflaged on a dark surface. The camouflage allows survival of the dark moth, and if obviously the dark moths survive, they will reproduce with one another, and their offspring or their babies will also be dark, so they will appear more, while the speckled moth that gets eaten because of a lack of camouflage will actually be less in numbers, and it would seem like they are disappearing. Now, in times of less pollution, surfaces get covered with lichens, which is speckled. Lichens have a grayish, flaky appearance. It's basically a fungus and an algae living together on the surfaces of tree trunks and park benches and things like that. And they don't like growing in polluted air. So in the effort of cleaning up Europe's air, efforts were made to reduce pollution, and lichens started growing everywhere again, making the surfaces light. Now, as you can see on the lighter speckled surfaces, the dark moth now stands out clearly. If birds or other predators fly past, they will see the dark moth easier because it's not as well camouflaged, and the dark moth will start disappearing because they're all eaten. Can you see on the slide the light speckled moth? There it is, indeed well camouflaged. So as I said just now, in times of less pollution, when the surfaces are covered with speckled lichens, there's much less dark surfaces, the speckled moth is now favored, and then the dark moth is going to be rare. So the speckled moth shows you how natural selection actually occurs because of the environment. Whichever moth is favored is going to survive and reproduce offspring like itself. So just remember, in an exam, if they ask you to give an example for 2 marks, you simply mention it's the speckled moth from the UK, where you have the dark variant and the speckled variant. However, if they ask you to do it in detail, it's the 8 to 12 mark question, where you use Many Vets Rescue Babies. Here you can see an example of such a question. It usually will start with something like, use the theory of natural selection to explain, and then they're going to give you 2 scenarios. So if we use the how ducks develop or evolved webbed feet, the sources they will give you will actually give you examples of ducks with webbed feet and without webbed feet, like this. The source on the left explains that you find in America, you actually find a bird, a duck, called the American coot. Doesn't have webbed feet like a duck, but it's got long toes with broad lobes in between that can kick through the water. And these folds, the broad lobes can fold back when it walks on land. But then it also gives a source on the right-hand side, which explains that ducks use their feet for swimming and that they've got webs in between that are uniquely designed to keep them to help them move through the water. Now, obviously, by implication, these 2 sources are showing you or trying to explain that ducks could have evolved from a population of birds that looked like ducks, but not all of them had webbed feet. So if this is a question out of 10 or 12 marks, how would you explain how duck got their webbed feet? So let's try this. Okay, so in this scenario with the birdies, the ducks, they are saying that initially ducks had no webbed feet, okay, and they evolved into ducks with webbed feet. Now, the thing is, they are asking you to explain how that happened using the theory of natural selection, Darwin's theory. Now, we know that natural selection only happens if the environment changes or when the environment changes. Which means, if we think of this realistically, where would we find ducks with no webbed feet? Obviously, in conditions that are drier. So I'm just going to put that in inverted commas because you don't have to explain that in detail. And then ducks with webbed feet obviously like water, so we're going to have wetter conditions. So if we want to try and explain how ducks got their webbed feet, it's going to obviously involve an environment changing from a drier one to a wetter one. So when we explain this in an exam, we are going to use our Many Vets Rescue Babies acronym always. We're always going to use that to answer. So the M we know stands for more individuals are born than environment can sustain. But we're not talking in general now. We're talking specifically about ducks. So we're going to say more ducklings are born than the environment can sustain. So more ducklings are born in an environment than that environment can actually sustain. Now, amongst those ducklings, which is where you get your mark, we're going to see variations. So that's why we have the V. So variations exists amongst the ducklings. But we need to say what those variations are. So although you're going to get a mark for the word variations, you will have to say what those variations are. So I'm going to imagine that amongst all the ducklings there were variations in the sense that some had webs, or we could say large toe flaps, all right, or skin flaps, and others had none or smaller toe flaps. Okay, so we need to kind of distinguish, let me just split this, between the actual variations. So 1 mark for saying there were variations, but a whole extra mark for saying what those variations are. Now, this information you get from the sources given. The E always stands for environment. So the environment changes. Otherwise, we're not going to have evolution happening. But again, we're not just going to get a mark for that. We actually need to say how it's changed. And we've already imagined it's going to go from a drier area to a wetter area. So either a climate change happened, or there was some natural disaster or something like that which caused the environment to go from a dry environment to a wet environment. Now, I know it sounds English, sistoch, you could seriously use a better English, vocabulary words and stuff, but it doesn't matter. You'll get a mark for saying it in your own words. How did the environment change? Now, the T we know is for trait. So in our Many Vets Rescue Babies, T is for traits. But certain traits will be more suitable. And if we think of a drier area becoming a wetter area, which one of these traits amongst the babies is going to be more suitable for a wet area? So the traits that are most suitable in this case would be the ones with larger toe flaps or webs. So the traits that are most suitable would be the ones would be with webs or with toe flaps, anything like that. Okay, even again, if you put it in inverted in your own words, you'll get a mark for saying which actual trait would be the suitable one. So the trait that are most suitable would be the toe flaps. And then obviously the suitable traits survive.
So we actually have the many vets. S stands for survival of ducklings with the suitable traits, which is the webs. Okay. And then obviously R is for reproduction, because reproduction would occur between the surviving ducklings or the surviving ducks, which means the ones with the toe flaps. And that would mean that the babies are born resembling their parents. And if they resemble their surviving parents, it would mean that the babies actually will have, so the babies will have toe flaps or webbed feet. So in an exam, remember a question like this would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Anything between 8 and 12 marks, and in this case it was 10. So always whenever you get a paragraph explaining something and explaining something else, it's going to be information that's not necessarily in your exam. But notice the changes are always linked to the environment. And to try and explain this using natural selection, use your Many Vets Rescue Babies as a cheat. This is your cheat. You're going to start your question by writing this down first and then applying this information to the ducks. Now, the rate of change in a population from one species to another is obviously unknown. We don't know how it happens, but there are two basic theories. The pattern or the trend of evolution and the rate of change over time is explained either by punctuated equilibrium or gradualism. According to gradualism, evolution took place by means of a slow, gradual accumulation of changes in a species because of climate or environmental change. And it's best understood if we look at a simple graph. On the y-axis, we see evolution or the rate of change, while on the bottom on the x-axis, we see time. Now, species 1, the yellow line, changes into a kind of brown line, species 2, and then into species 3, the reddish line. But the actual transition from species 1 and 2, or from 2 into 3, is so small that you don't distinctly see when the one changes into the other. So it's little changes that you don't really see significantly. Okay, this is now a big change, and then the species remains unchanged. So very small changes. Punctuated equilibrium, on the other hand, says that evolution occurred in big jumps and not small steps. So very little change will occur in a population over a long time, and then a sudden change occurs in a short period of time. And the graph in this case would look completely different. Again, the rate of change is on the y-axis and time is at the bottom, but you can see species 1 in yellow. The flat line shows that there is actually no change in the appearance of this species for quite a long time. Then there's quickly a gradient, like a rise, or like in the line, which shows in a short period of time there was a very sudden change into species 2. And then the flat line at species 2 again shows how species 2 remained unchanged, looking the way they looked for a long period of time. Then again, species 2 changed into species 3 in a very short period of time. You had a lot of change indicated by that steep gradient. And then species 3, the flat-lined area, again, species 3 will exist like this for a long time unchanged. Now, as we know, humans are pretty smart, so they figured out artificial selection. In other words, using the principles of natural selection, but to benefit us. So whenever a breeder selects individuals with certain desirable traits to show in the successive generations, it is called artificial selection.
And as you probably know, an example of artificial selection in domesticated animals will actually be the selective breeding of dogs to display desirable traits. So if you want a guard dog, you're obviously going to use the buddy on the very right-hand side. And if you want a little handbag dog, you're going to pick ones from the left-hand side in this line. Because if a mommy and a daddy dog has specific traits that you want, you know breeding them together is going to result in pups like the parents. An example of artificial selection in crops is how farmers have cultivated various crops such as cabbage, cauliflower, and broccoli from wild mustard. So many generations ago, one species of wild mustard grew in different variations, and each variant was specifically picked or selected by a farmer. Whatever trait the farmer wanted, he would select wild mustard with that variant and keep cultivating, keep on pollinating this specific variant with itself or with closely related, closely looking plants, eventually leading to all the different variations of crops we have today.